Hello, everybody. Welcome to VCs at UCD, your one-stop shop for learning about venture capital here on campus at UC Davis. My name is Aaron Anderson. I'm the director of the Startup Center here, if you haven't met me before. As you come in, we ask that you turn your cameras on, mute your mics. The goal today is to have a great conversation, and conversations always happen better when you can see the people you're talking to. So please, if bandwidth allows, get those cameras on. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Seana Day from Culterra Capital. I've known Seana for a number of years now, and she is an absolute expert in the space of ag tech, agriculture tech, and food, and just anything you ever wanted to know about how technology intersects the food supply chain. So rather than steal Shauna's thunder and tell her story, I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell the story from here. But let's give Seana a round of applause. And well, Seana, the time is yours. So I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. So hi, everybody. Great to be with you. My name is Seana Day. I'm a partner with Culterra Capital and Better Food Ventures, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how those two things break down. But I think the first area that Aaron asked me to talk about is really just how I got into investing in startup companies and sort of a little bit about my history. So I grew up in Turlock, just down Highway 99 for most of you, and I'm a fourth generation Turlock resident. I moved back to Turlock about 6 years ago, but really my career, once I left in the late 90s, went to college at the University of Colorado at Boulder, studied political science. I thought I was going to be a lawyer, but I ended up becoming an investment banker. So I started working in finance as soon as I graduated from college and never really looked back from there. Spent about 8 years in the Denver area, ended up getting my MBA at the University of Denver and started my investment banking career. So advising in mergers and acquisitions and private equity in the early 2000s, and worked with consumer products companies. One of the things that happened in probably about 2004 or 5 is I decided I was ready to come back to California, as a lot of people from California end up doing. And I got a great opportunity to work with a boutique investment bank out of the Bay Area called Ridgecrest Capital Partners. And we were focused on technology and exclusively focused on tech, primarily mobile and communications and really that kind of mobility sector. And if anybody on this phone can remember the days before the iPhone, we were doing a lot of deals in mobile and wireless before there was a smartphone. And we were trying to sell mobile advertising companies when people were still using flip phones. So that was pretty challenging, but it was a great time to learn a lot about technology and a lot about that industry. And the other thing that it gave me an opportunity to do was really to work on cross-border deals. So most of the action at that time was really happening in Europe when it came to mobile devices and wireless technologies. So in my mid-20s, I got unique opportunities to spend a lot of time in Europe, going back and forth, selling companies and advising in private placements. So fast forward about 5 or 6 years to 2010. And I had gone to work for a larger investment bank out of the East Coast, and I was in the San Francisco office, and I got an amazing opportunity to move to London to open their office. And we were still working with tech companies, and I jumped all over that and moved to London, worked there for about 3 years, and then the last year I went to work for one of the companies I'd sold a few businesses to. And all along the way, I was advising in mergers and acquisitions and private equity. So really built up, a lot of experience in that space, and then went to work for a company, like I said, that I'd sold a few businesses to and ran restructuring and operations for that company. And that was the first time I really got a chance to spend time, as they say, on the other side of the table, and being on the buy side and figuring out how you integrate, 6 or 7 acquisitions back to back over the course of a year. And most of those were European acquisitions. And so there were a lot of complexities. And I would say one of the biggest challenges that I encountered there is that as head of restructuring, that means you're laying off a lot of people when you acquire a business. And I think I learned pretty quickly that wasn't something that I necessarily wanted to spend my career being the hatchet woman. So, while I learned a lot, I decided it was time for me to maybe come back to California. And honestly, around that time, we're talking 2014, there was a catalyzing event in my career, and that was Monsanto's acquisition of a company called Climate Corp. And they acquired Climate for almost $1 billion. And this was the first time anybody had ever heard about an ag tech deal for the most part. And I kind of sat up and said, well, that's interesting. You know, my roots are in agriculture. My parents don't farm, but my cousins farm for us, and we've got some almond orchards. And I'd grown up in Turlock and been in and around ag my whole sort of younger part of my life. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Maybe there's something here. I'm going to go home and see if my, farmer friends and family are talking about technology in the same way that my Silicon Valley friends are talking about it. And lo and behold, there wasn't a lot of overlap. People were saying, oh yeah, I've got a sensor or some, piece of junk in the back of my barn that I never use and it doesn't work. And there were just a lot of disconnects between Central Valley ag, just ag in general, and Silicon Valley. And to me, that was a good opportunity because I understand how to speak both languages, and I could kind of be a translator, and I could help build those bridges between the two valleys, and then of course beyond as well. But that was really when I had my aha moment. And, we'll talk about experiences. I'm sure you guys will have some questions throughout the course of the next hour. But at a certain point in your career, you kind of figure out, where do I have a competitive advantage? And for me to go back to San Francisco and to be one of 1,000 bankers, going after 100 tech companies, it was going to be a pretty competitive slog. But coming back to the Central Valley and really understanding technology and really understanding finance and really understanding ag. Well, my ag learning curve came up pretty sharp, but that really became a competitive advantage in my career, and I could differentiate myself. And then we started to do some publications and kind of just thought leadership, and that's been really a defining, that 2014, 2015 period in my career when I honestly didn't know what I was going to be doing next, but I just knew that there was an opportunity, and there weren't a lot of people who could fill the gaps in that opportunity set. That sort of took some risk, but boy, I'll tell you, it's been the most exciting thing that I've done in my career, and I've done a lot of neat things. And I was just telling Aaron before you all joined the call, I'll do this for the rest of my life. I'm passionate about helping the food and ag ecosystem modernize, right? Adopt technology, become more digitized, be more efficient, be more sustainable. And there are just so many tremendous opportunities. But yeah, you'll hear over the course of the next couple of minutes how passionate I think I am about this sector, and I hope that it maybe sparks some interest in some of you as well. Yeah, guys, just real quick, I'll stop on the agenda. Here's what we're going to cover today. How I got here, you just heard. So we've already checked off the number one slot there. I'll talk a little bit about our thesis at Better Food Ventures, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what we do. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about also, how we approach, the business of venture capital and what it looks like to manage your portfolio. Some of the pitfalls and things that we get excited about, any advice. And I invite everybody, if you've got questions as we're moving through this, happy to pause and kind of answer some of your questions. And then we'll end in just some perspectives about where I'm seeing opportunities in the market and what you guys might be thinking about if you're interested in this kind of food tech, ag tech landscape. All right. There's me. There's a picture of me with a better hairdo and looking a little bit more put together. But anyway, that's a little bit more about my background. And then we can go to the next page. Okay, so just real quick, I'm going to go through kind of who we are and what we do. So there are two parts of our business, basically: Better Food Ventures and Culterra Capital. Better Food Ventures, we're a partnership of 4. I cover all things ag tech. So that's everything in field, farm technology, post-harvest, distribution. I have another business partner named Britta Rosenheim who covers all things food tech. So she's looking at consumer-facing technologies, restaurant technologies, meal delivery kits, all of that kind of stuff that's more consumer-facing. Third partner, Michael Rose, who's focused on indoor ag. So he's looking at controlled environment technologies. And then finally, our founder, Rob Trice, is kind of our jack of all trades. So he covers the whole ecosystem. At Better Food Ventures, we're making pre-seed and seed stage investments. Occasionally we'll do an A round, but typically the very early stage, oftentimes the first institutional money into a startup. And from a traction standpoint, we typically aren't investing in pre-revenue businesses, but it's very early stage revenue. From time to time, it will be pre-revenue, but just in our thesis, we really look for at least one or two customers and proof of concepts that people are demonstrating a willingness to pay for the service or some kind of some semblance of the service. Our lens is really colored through IT, so information technology, digital tools for food and ag. That's software, that's hardware, that's applications. There are a lot of people investing in and a lot of money that's being made in genetics, biosciences, animal sciences, feed additives. And then on the other side, on the consumer side, on consumer products, right? Brands, sort of boutique dairy products or alternative proteins. So those are the areas that we typically don't invest in. We really stick to technology, so IT for food and ag. Our team is just exclusively focused on that, so we're not making investments in any other type of software or hardware. It's really got to have a food and ag story. So between Britta and I, we cover about 3,000 companies across the food and ag tech landscape. And that continues to grow every year. And we'll talk a little bit more about where the investment dollars are coming and what areas are really hot from the investor standpoint. So that's Better Food Ventures. Britta and I also do work with Culterra Capital, and that really leverages my history and Britta's history in strategic advisory. So what does that mean? Big corporates are looking at this IT and innovation ecosystem, and they're saying, holy cow, it's time for us to really modernize our businesses. Consumers are more digital, our consumers are online, our supply chains are getting more and more connected. What do we do in order to stay competitive? And for a big corporate, that typically looks like either buying companies to maintain their innovation edge, investing in companies through corporate venture capital, or building capabilities internally. And so we kind of take that landscape work that we do, and we can help big corporates say, all right, let's do a deep dive into irrigation technology or retail restaurant technology or farm management software systems. Help us understand that and help us understand, should we buy, should we build, or should we be investing in this space? And on the bottom right corner, there's a bunch of logos of clients and investments that we've made over the last 5 or 6 years. All right, thank you, Erin. So I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about Better Food Ventures and investing, because this is a VC class, but happy to talk about mergers and acquisitions and capital markets if anybody's interested. But really, I'm going to focus most of this talk on Better Food Ventures and really thinking about our thesis in the market. So what is driving our interest? What are we excited about? We think that this trajectory ahead of us is long. We're in the first or second inning of food tech and ag tech investment. Having said that, last year, $30 billion went into the food tech and ag tech space globally across the whole market. So that doesn't sound like first or second inning, but when you compare it to the amount of capital that flows into other verticals of technology, we really are still pretty early days. We also fundamentally believe that the digital transformation that is ahead of us is going to have huge implications across the whole supply chain. So whether you are an almond farmer in Turlock, you're a dairyman in Fresno, or a sort of brand new food brand in Chicago, technology is going to be essential in terms of helping with competitiveness, with productivity, with more sustainability. And you'll see in a slide or two how pressing that need is and how far we need to go in terms of digitizing the food and ag supply chain. There are some key sort of technology things that have happened over the course of the last decade or so that really have made it possible for this digital revolution in food and ag. Mobility, right? Cloud computing. We're starting to see cheaper and cheaper analytics, machine learning capabilities. We're seeing more connected Internet of Things and sensors. That kind of Internet of Things ecosystem is becoming a real game changer, especially when we're talking about getting data and information out of the field, whether it's soil moisture data, whether it's vision systems for robotics, whether it's irrigation information. So really having the ability to connect data from these devices in a cloud-based system and help those farmers and ag professionals with decision support has been, over the course of the last even 3 or 4 years, has just leapfrogged in terms of maturity and adoption. We're really excited about what we're seeing on the automation and artificial intelligence side. I think that holds huge promise in food and ag. And then of course, we all talk a lot about traceability and transparency in the food system, and really having those technology systems to create a more collaborative sort of food supply chain and ecosystem where we can share that data, and the consumer then has access to more transparent data. People want to know where their food comes from, what's in it, how it was produced, and really make decisions based on that level of transparency. Okay, so this is the slide that I was telling you about. People often get pretty surprised when they see it. But this is from a report that McKinsey did. McKinsey's a big consulting firm. They did it a couple of years ago, looking at digitalization across the main sectors of our economy. And you can see with that bottom arrow that agriculture and hunting are actually looped together. And there's a lot of red there indicating very low digitalization. So for me, that is a really exciting, for an investor, that's a really exciting opportunity, because it means there's low hanging fruit. It means that there's a lot of potential for transformational investment. And when you overlay that with the fact that food and ag represents more than 10 to 15% of the world's economy, we're talking about big numbers. We're talking about a lot of spend that is going to go into this sector. In California alone, just the farm gate value of ag is worth about $50 billion. And then when you layer on food processing, which if you're from the Central Valley or know the Central Valley, we've got a lot of food processing facilities here. That's another $200 billion market opportunity. So, this is a sliver of the whole global opportunity, and specialty crops and high value crops are certainly extremely important exports for the US. But this just gives you a sense for the scale and scope of the opportunity that we at Better Food Ventures are going after. Okay, so this is just a little bit more about our investment thesis. So fundamentally, we also look at impact, and positive impact is one of our investment themes. So of the 7 companies that we've invested in to date, we really look for, is that company creating a positive impact on the food system? And what does that mean? So for us, we define that in 5 ways: connectivity and agility, productivity and economic stability, sustainability and transparency, precision and personalization. So that's personalized nutrition, personalized health, and finally, nutritional health and wellness. And we feel like if we can target companies that are focused on one or more of these overall ecosystem improvements, we're investing in companies that we think are doing good for society and doing good for the environment. So like I said, we've invested in 7 companies to date. We are about to announce an 8th, which is, I've long awaited, a livestock tech or dairy tech company that we've been able to invest in. So that will be public in the next few weeks. But the companies that the logos that you see here really kind of span both the food and ag tech system. The one that I'll kind of call out in particular is a company called Bountiful. And I love this story because the CEO, Megan Nunes, is an entrepreneur who was born and raised in Gustine, which I don't know if anybody on the line knows where Gustine is, but it's not far from Turlock and Hilmar, real small town. And Megan is just a dynamo. She was an entrepreneur who went to Cal Poly. She spent most of her early career in satellite imaging, and now about 5 years ago or 4 years ago, she created a company that focuses on yield forecasting for specialty crops. So for grapes and almonds and other permanent crops. And she's really done a fantastic job of helping bring some of that data and insight into the market. So traders, so processors can have a better sense for how much yields are going to look like coming out of the field, what the volumes are, what the timing is. And yeah, it's just been really exciting to be a part of Megan's journey. And we think she's just a fantastic entrepreneur.
on the one hand, ag tech feels, really specific as an investment thesis, and on the other, you've just demonstrated like these million divisions, and now I'm starting to wonder if it's really broad. How do you balance the need for expertise in a specific industry with finding deals that can get really, really big and
Yeah.
be players in, this 50 or $200 billion industry you're talking about?
Great question. So it's probably an answer that will differ, depending on who you talk to. But I would say, in particular, at the very early stage, which is where we're focused, having that domain expertise um, to be able to understand what's hype and what's reality. What are real farming challenges? What does it feel like to be in the field, um, using a piece of technology or having to fix a piece of technology because a gopher has chewed through, the sensor. So like having that level of understanding of what the pain point is for your customers or the target customers or in the market, I think is a real advantage. Especially because agriculture is different, right? It's not like selling an app, a consumer app. It's not social media. It's not sort of these consumer technologies, and it's not enterprise technology. So it's not sort of selling an ERP or a finance system to a big corporate. A farmer is a very different type of buyer, and the sales cycles are long. You've got one harvest a year most of the time. Sometimes if you're growing lettuce or berries, you've got a couple. But let's say for the sake of argument, most farming operations have one harvest a year, which means that if you're selling technology to that farmer, you've got to be selling something that meets their needs at a certain period of time. And you got a short window to do that. So all of that kind of domain expertise, I think, has been a big advantage for us, just in terms of not only identifying companies that we want to potentially invest in or get to know and track, but being able to separate the noise from the just kind of onslaught of startup activity that we're seeing. Now, I'm going to contrast that and say, as you get into later stage investments, beyond that kind of real early risk capital, you're starting to look at growth equity, which, we're talking $20 million checks, $30 million checks, $100 million checks, where the business proposition has really been proven. You've got customers who are paying for a product on a recurring basis. There's visibility. There's not the same technology risk. There's not the same adoption and execution risk. It's really about how do you scale this more quickly. Then you start to see more generalist firms that are, appropriate investors for that kind of scale up. And as you get into private equity, again, there's some that are focused on certain domains or verticals, but it really becomes more about, the investments become more about financial engineering than that business expertise. And there's a board that has that level of expertise from other folks, for example. And it's just it's a more mature business, and the needs of that business are more mature. So I think for us, being focused on the early stage and being very deep domain experts, we feel like that's a real advantage in this kind of early stage stuff.
Awesome. No, that makes a lot of sense. Appreciate it.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what it looks like to be in venture. And the way that we kind of coin this, we think about our job in three ways: finding, grinding, and minding deals. So the finding part is fun, right? That's the fun part, where you're just out talking to as many companies as you can and learning about maybe a certain subsector or a certain need in the market. And over the course of a year, we'll among the four of us, we could easily see a couple thousand deals, if not more. So from that point, it's really, how do we take something from, oh, this is kind of interesting, we read the one-page teaser, or we know the entrepreneur, to let's dig in and do a little bit of diligence. And that becomes a much, much tighter funnel, because between the four of us, it takes time to move from that finding into the deal grinding. And grinding is what we call the due diligence phase, where you're really spending time with that company, unpacking the data room, talking to them about the challenges and what they're doing really well and what their intellectual property strategy is going to look like, and really sort of understanding their financial model. What are their expectations for the next 12 months, 2 years? What assumptions are they making? If it's a very early stage company and they're still trying to figure out their pricing model, for example, what kinds of assumptions are they making about their revenues? What kind of assumptions are they making about their expenses? When are they going to hit break even? How do you balance? As an early stage investor, we put a high premium on growth. And how do you manage growing your business versus understanding how to run a capital efficient business where you're not burning, millions of dollars a year, unless you're in some sort of heavy art research and development. But this is where we really have to roll up our sleeves and go pretty deep. And we will maybe look at 15 to 20 diligence processes a year. We've only ended up making on average probably 2 or 3 investments. So if you take that funnel and think about how many companies we're looking at versus how many investments we actually make, it's a very, very small number. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs probably are surprised to hear that, because everybody thinks their baby's the prettiest baby out there. And it's hard to say, this baby isn't for us. But yeah, we look at a lot of deals on that fine side. We grind a lot fewer deals. And then once we do decide to pull the trigger and invest in a company, this is where the domain expertise, I think, really becomes important, because the last sort of phase of what we do is minding, and that's minding the deal. And that takes years and years and years of us being a partner to those entrepreneurs, helping grow their business, helping syndicate new rounds of capital, bring in new investors. I think we've really kind of, I feel very proud of the work that our team has done, because we have been so hands-on on the mind side by helping recruit, helping with business development opportunities, helping those companies think about strategy. So yeah, I think that find, grind, and mind is an interesting way to kind of look at how a VC spends their day, and where the fun stuff is, where the hard stuff is, and where the really hard stuff is. And at the end of the day, the minding bit is about, ultimately we're all investors, and we'll ultimately look for an exit. We'll look for a liquidity event to return capital to our investors. And I think that's where this whole idea of value creation really becomes extremely important. And what can we be doing to create more value for that company, for that entrepreneur, for the other investors? So yeah, that's the kind of long and short. And then when it comes to managing the portfolio, again, there are kind of rules of thumb as you're an investor, how many board seats you ideally want to sit on. You can only spread, we got to spend, our days managing these 3 activities. And there are times when I'm spending way, way more of my day on the minding, and I'm helping somebody, put together a credit application, or we're helping people look at PPP loans. We do a lot of that stuff for those companies, and that is portfolio management. And sometimes they're hard conversations, right? Sometimes, we see an entrepreneur or CEO that's starting to get too distracted, chasing too many sort of ancillary projects or special projects, and they're not focusing on creating a kind of repeatable process with their technology or with their products. And that's when we've got to kind of step in and make sure we're being good mentors and good partners, but also having the hard conversations when they have to happen. I think one of the there are 1 or 2 examples in the portfolio that we've really had to say, okay, either you go it's time to go raise more money, or it's time to think about finding a buyer for this business. And that's not always an easy conversation to have with a CEO, but it's a necessary one sometimes. And yeah, I think you got to just, if this is an area that's interesting to you, just have to sort of remind yourself that it's not always about the fun finding and just finding great companies and cool technologies and having a perspective, but it's really about rolling up your sleeves and being a good partner to those entrepreneurs. Okay, so this may or may not be interesting to you guys, but one of the things that Aaron asked to at least mention here is just kind of comment, like what are red lines, what are no's, what are yeses. So for us today, this is kind of how we think about when we're looking at that finding part of our pipeline. things that are an automatic yes, let's take a deeper look, things that are a maybe, and things that are an automatic no. So for us in the food tech and ag tech space, we like things we like technologies that are helping to advance traceability and transparency. And that's not only on farm, but also in the food supply chain. So my partner Britta and I have spent most of our COVID lockdown time in 2020 actually looking from the farm gate to, let's say, the loading dock of a grocery store or a Chipotle or a fast food restaurant or a Hershey or a consumer products company. And we really think about that in a couple of different dimensions. So we think about that in the first mile. So what happens from the farm gate to your primary processor, whether it's a packer that's receiving melons, or it is a bakery that is receiving wheat or flour. What's happening in that first mile, then what's happening in the food processing sector, what's happening in the manufacturing, what technologies are those guys using, how do they need to adopt more tech to help them with traceability and transparency. Then of course distribution and trucking and logistics. There are a number of companies that are focused on that for the food supply chain specifically. And then finally, one of the areas that I think we've actually seen the most technology and really interesting technology adoption is on the demand side. So all of this information that your grocery stores are collecting about who's buying what and when, how does that feed into the food supply chain? And how does that provide better traceability and traceability and transparency, and also better demand planning? So can we ultimately get to a point where we know what the consumer is going to demand in September? Are the farmers producing for that demand? And today that doesn't really exist. We very much have a kind of supply driven system where a farmer grows stuff and they put it in the market and they take whatever price they get for it. But over time, we believe that there's a real opportunity to fine tune that more so that we know a lot more about demand and how to produce for that demand. Marketplaces, logistics marketplaces, I think that's something that's really interesting. I mean, when you think about how much capital, how much investment is spent in fuel and moving products from point A to point B. And if we're growing blueberries in Oregon and we're shipping them to Florida, well, what if you could grow blueberries in North Carolina and ship them to Florida? Are we really optimizing the logistics around our food supply chain? That's an area we're really excited about right now. Anything that's touching labor, as you all heard, everybody talks about labor and labor shortages, challenges with workforce readiness. So we're looking at not only technologies that will ultimately replace humans, but really technologies that make humans more productive and that make their job easier, less challenging. We are looking at some controlled environment technologies. We like to call our thesis really more picks and shovels. And this is a really old school term, but when the gold rush was happening in California, there were people like Levi Strauss who wanted to sell stuff to the gold miners. They didn't want to be in the business of mining gold, but they were going to sell the picks and shovels. They were going to sell the Levi's jeans to those miners. And we really have much of the same perspective in food and ag. We don't want to own ag land. We don't want to own operations. We want to sell the technologies, the picks and shovels, to those producers. Big data and analytics, that's really prevalent in our portfolio now. Most of the companies that we've invested in are really using data analytics. And as a result, they tend to be more capital efficient because they're not necessarily the ones providing the hardware that goes in the field, that goes in the grocery store, that goes in the supply chain, but they're doing the data analysis. They're creating the food and ag specific data sets. They're doing the machine learning. And that's really what we see as a kind of capital efficient, scalable business model. And then the final thing on this is really, this is more of a business problem that we get really interested in companies that are trying to solve. And it's, how do you, for most of our kind of understanding of agriculture, it's how do you maximize yield, right? How do I get more bushels? How do I get more pounds? How do I get more milk from a unit of economics? Well, our hypothesis is really rather than maximizing or increasing yield, why aren't we doing more to farm for cash flow and for profitability? And really that becomes a function of precision farming. So if I know that I'm farming a 100-acre farm, and maybe my back 10 acres, they're just on crappy soil and nothing's ever really that, yeah, I never really get a lot of yield from that back 10 acres. Well, why don't I apply less nitrogen? Why don't I apply a little bit less water? Why don't I should farm for that rather than a one size fits all. It's really be more precise with how we use our inputs in order to maximize cash flow or profitability. Okay, so those are the yes things. As you can tell, that's the stuff that we're particularly interested in. The maybe stuff, um, we're dabbling right now a little bit in personalized nutrition and wellness, bioinformatics. We're still kind of trying to get smarter on that sector, and a lot of that's genetics based. So we are again in that theme of picks and shovels. We don't want to be investing in the genetics in the products, but what kinds of AI and machine learning tools are being used to focus on those markets. We're looking at food recovery, but I would say we've not pulled the trigger on any investments in that space. I think there's a market there, there's an opportunity there to take second stuff that might not fit a spec for Walmart or for Safeway because it's got the wrong color or it's too small, but perhaps there are other processors or people who are creating food products that can use those seconds and making that an easier kind of marketplace. And then the other area that we haven't been terribly active in, although we've looked around, is really developing markets. So most of our work is done in North America because we are early stage investors. And that's one thing, as a group from the States, you might not think about it as much, but for seed stage and early stage investors, we really tend to like to stick to companies within a couple of time zones because, as I said before, on that minding piece, so much of our work is really rolling up our sleeves and spending time with those companies. It just makes it a lot harder if it's, could be a great coffee harvesting company in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's going to be really hard for us to add a lot of value to that company. And then, as I said, I think kind of at the outset, we're not investing in physical locations and farming operations and food products, and it's primarily because they just take a lot more capital, and so that's just not the way that our investment deployment model is structured. Thought you guys might be interested in just how big these markets, the investments for food and ag, have gotten over the last couple of years. So when I stepped into it, it was about 2014. 5.7 billion went into globally food tech and ag tech companies. This number was just released in the last couple of days. In 2020, 30.5 billion. So in a year that the rest of the economy was hammered by COVID, we really saw a lot of those dislocations, a lot of those challenges were kind of laid bare in our food supply chain. And I think that got a lot of investors a lot more focused on the real pressing needs in this market. So the headline here is, this is an exceptionally high growth market. And then the next page, thought you guys might be interested in just the kind of distribution of where California lies in that. So 25% of the dollars, 35% of the deals last year came from California-based food tech and ag tech startups. So obviously we have a huge competitive advantage here, just in terms of funding great founders and funding great ideas. Okay, so I think Aaron said I should talk a little bit about what makes me excited, what makes me less excited when I see entrepreneurs or pitches or stories, hitting the bullseye, right? If a company or an entrepreneur can align big opportunity, great idea, solid technology, we're early stage, so we understand that the technology is going to take some time to evolve, but that kind of that integration of a great idea and having the right technology, how hard is it going to be to drive adoption? I think that in ag tech has been a real challenge for a lot of companies. Is there inertia, right? Is there a propensity to say, hey, I've always done it this way. My grandfather did it this way. My father did it this way. I don't want to change. That has been a challenge for many, many ag tech, farm tech companies. And it's changing, but it's not changing fast. So that's something that's a very real challenge for us. Um, a company or an entrepreneur who understands the channels to market, right? Who understands I need to partner with a bank, I need to partner with an input provider, I need to partner with an agronomist in order to sell this. Those guys are usually doing a little bit better because they understand how to work through the ecosystem. Certainly team quality is something, you hear all the time. uh, Early stage investors, venture capitalists, they fund teams, primarily technology secondarily. You can always kind of fix the product, you can fix the technology, but if you have a dysfunctional team, you can't fix that. And then finally, market size. So that's again, has been somewhat challenging from time to time in ag, but yeah, market size is an important one as well. Okay, so what makes me worried? Same thing, team, right? When we see a team who I would say the biggest challenge, especially with a relatively new or unproven team, is coachability. And are the entrepreneurs, is there a good team dynamic? Is there a good balance with tech talent, domain talent? Do they work well together? And are they coachable? Are they receptive to feedback and advice? Certainly competition, and I'll talk about this in a second when we look at sort of opportunities for the future, but we like spaces that are fragmented. We like spaces that perhaps there isn't a lot of existing competition, especially competition that's a lot further along or better capitalized. Culture, again, that's part of that kind of chemistry piece. Reliance on others, that's an important one as well. Not to say we don't appreciate collaboration and partnership and openness, to work with others in the industry. But really, if you're overly reliant on somebody outside of the company to understand how the pricing should work or understand the product market fit, that's a little bit of a red flag for us. And then it comes down to execution. Is the team willing to get up every day and put 110% in, even when they're getting kicked in the teeth? It feels like nothing's going their way. Do they have that kind of grit to continue to get up and execute on the business? And then finally, as you start to look at subsequent rounds of funding beyond the early stage, the first money in, can you put together a good syndicate? Can you put together a good group of investors who's going to bring not only capital to the table, but other business value as well? This is just a real quick, people are always, well, why do companies fail? Why do such a high proportion of portfolio companies, either get a very modest or not a very interesting return on the investment? So one, product market fit. The market just didn't come together in time. And there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of this, thousands of examples of this. And really that kind of boils down to how well did the team understand the market and what the needs of the market were and the market readiness. I don't know if anybody remembers Webvan, but that was like the first iteration of, Amazon basically. And that was in the late 1990s. And it was basically the same thing that Amazon's doing with groceries, and the market just wasn't ready for it yet. We didn't have great user interfaces. We didn't have mobile devices that we could order, whatever we wanted when we wanted it. So it was just the wrong time, but the business model was the right model. Management doesn't execute. Again, that kind of comes down to really understanding the strength of the management team. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean you've been in the business for 30 years, but there's that management piece that cannot be underscored. And then the technical part, you just might have a great idea, but you can't bring together the technical execution of the product in a timely manner, or everything's going to cost more and take longer. We understand that, but just making too many mistakes on the product and on the technology will be a deal killer as well. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to hit kind of startup opportunities. So I published a couple of landscape maps. This is the farm tech one, and then on the next page is the food supply chain tech one. And you see a lot of logos on these pages. So between these two maps, there's probably about 600 or 700 logos. Behind that, there's another 1,500 companies that we track. I put these up to say, look, again, to that competition, if you're thinking about starting a company, really look for white space. Look for those spaces where there aren't a lot of existing incumbents. Um, we always have this kind of remarks about me, oh, it's another me too. And just as an investor, you kind of glaze over those. You really want to see something that is a unique approach. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of people that go through accelerators and incubators probably don't do the real work to figure out who's already in the space and how they as a company, if they're going to go after a crowded part of the market, you better have a really good differentiation, sort of set of product differentiation and a really like good way of attacking that market if it's a crowded one. So I think when I think about startup opportunities, it's really look for where there's a clear pain in the market. So again, one of our other little phrases is it a vitamin or is it a pain pill? We don't invest in vitamins, the nice to haves. We invest in the need to haves. I guess those are my two kind of, look for white space and have it be a pain pill and not a vitamin. That's it.
Awesome, Shauna. This was spectacular. I really appreciate it. I see you've thrown your email address up there. Okay, if
Yep,
students have questions, they
you bet.
shoot it to you.
You bet.
Awesome. Well, folks, we are right at the end of our time here. So let's quickly give Shauna a round of applause again. Shauna, thank you again. This was just excellent. I appreciate the detail. And thank you for coming to UC
Yeah,
Davis, a school that I think is particularly interested and relevant in what you're working on.
always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course.